Okay, psychological treatments. Previously we looked at biological with SSRIs, and now we're going to look at psychological treatments. And you'll see I'm sticking with my approach of going in depth as opposed to breadth. I think looking at one biological treatment, one psychological treatment, I think that's going to be more than enough. Just simply because of the amount of time they've given us. Obviously, if you want to add more content, add more to it, then be my guest. But I'm focusing on depth with my materials. So we're just looking at same structure as the biological treatments, just an introduction to exposure therapies and what they are and how they work. These are the psychological treatments we're going to look at, different types of exposure therapies, and then we'll look at the research that shows their effectiveness. And really, so what you can see here is the effectiveness of psychological treatments. Effectiveness of treatment is a topic by itself in the guide, but I mean, I'm not sure what they want there except for us to evaluate the effectiveness, but then this is essentially the same thing we're going to be doing for discussing psychological treatment or biological treatment. So those topics are really one and the same, I think, in the same studies, same ideas can be used to apply to both those different topics. So to begin with, we're just going to look at exposure therapies. So just we can review where we've been so far. We looked at biological treatments with SSRIs, and now we're looking at psychotherapies. And what we're looking at here is the concept of fear extinction in this first lesson. So the would have been introduced to fear conditioning as we've gone through PTSD, and now we're looking at fear extinction, and because that's a key part of treating the psychological aspect of PTSD, and we're looking at how that might be accomplished with exposure therapy. First few minutes, there's a compare and contrast. This could be a one exam question that they might get is is it compare or contrast? One of those is a command term. Contrast, I think, is a command term that they might get for maybe for a psychological and biological treatment. And so what I would put here is, here this is for the explanations of the disorder. So here they could put one explanation and the other. So biological and another one perhaps. Look at how they're similar and then how they're different. Now this is an alternative one. I may or may not do this activity, I'm not sure, but sometimes what I like to do is give all the students the building blocks, give them all the answers, and then they have to try and piece these together to answer a question. And so they just, maybe, and here my instructions are pretty vague, create an explanation of an important idea. So they're just trying to piece these together and try and make sense of it and try and come up with some sort of explanation. So this might be a good bit of remedial if your students are struggling with it. If they've got everything, then you might skip this activity. But an easy bit of problem solving, right? Jackie's fear of feathers, Ryan's fear of heights, how would you cure their fears? And hopefully what they'll come up with is something along the lines of either flooding or probably come up with flooding is most likely. They might come up with systematic desensitization. And then we're going to lead into an explanation of what these are. Okay, what's meant by flooding and systematic desensitization. These are a couple of common treatments for anxiety. And then we can see a couple of videos about this. So these are really I want to start with these because they're very basic psychotherapies, very easy for students to comprehend, build the confidence, especially with weaker students, before we get into the really tricky stuff. Now here's where it gets a little bit more complex. So if we think of psychotherapies, a big umbrella term would be cognitive behavioral therapy, and I think it's really valuable to see how the different terms relate to one another. So CBT is the overall umbrella term, and exposure therapy is a type of CBT, and then we have three different types of exposure therapies related to that. So there's virtual reality, imagination therapy, and flooding systematic desensitization. So we've got CBT is the broad exposure therapy, and then we're looking at different types of exposure therapy is what we're going to look at in this topic. Okay, and then now we explain the concept of fear extinction. And I'd say it's sort of the opposite of fear conditioning, but where it's removing or extinguishing a conditioned fear. Now, one thing that's pretty important, I don't know if it's that important to know, but just a technicality is that fear conditioning isn't removing the conditioned fear, but it's replacing it with new learning. And so that's the key. Yeah. So for example, if you have a conditioned fear, and then you go through the fear extinction, so you lose that conditioned fear, that conditioning is actually still there, and you can be reconditioned to fear that stimulus much faster than it originally took. So that's why one reason why they think that the fear conditioning never disappears. The memory trace is still there, but we've just overridden it with some new neural network with the fear extinction. The neural network that's saying that's not. Don't be so afraid of that. But the conditioning hasn't been replaced. Just a technicality. Okay, and then we get into exposure therapies and explaining what this is. And two types can include this, VRET and imagination therapy. And so I think, and this is again just more chalk and talk, just explaining, giving real life examples how this works. You might just decide to let the students read this at home in the textbook, and then you could save on the chalk and talk if you like. But then we get into a group task, and so as much as possible I like to use real life examples to make it concrete, or I mean not real life but sort of fictional concrete examples. And so we've studied PTSD in Israel with the terrorist attacks in the early 2000s. So I've given a little case study here of Lena in the workbook, and they have to try and decide which psychotherapy would work for her. And I think one of my instructions as well is that, you know, she's hesitant to follow this, and so you have to really explain why is this going to work. And this is getting them to be able to understand and explain how these psychotherapies are going to try and address the root cause of her PTSD. Okay, and then we do a little bit of a reflection. So I think if they can explain with Lena's task, then they should be able to answer this guiding question. They won't need to do it. But then we can just reflect at the end. How can fear extinction be accomplished with exposure therapy? And they should be able to put that into a few sentences to explain it. Now, optional at the end if you have time or if you want to set for homework. I think this is fascinating from this PBS documentary about memory hackers, where they take a drug and then they expose participants to spiders to cure them of that phobia. And it gets a bit technical with how the drugs interfere with the neurochemistry. But yeah, really interesting, and you can actually see the progress that these participants are making. So yeah, I'll let you decide how you want to do that. But it's so cool, I wanted to include it in the plan. Right, and then something for homework. So again, no studies, no research yet in this lesson. This is just understanding psychotherapies and exposure therapy, and hopefully they'll have a good grounding of that, because in the next lesson we'll spend the time looking at the study.